recording thing. All right, well, let us get started. I think I know most of you, but not all. So my name is Joe Shaw, and I'm the president of the SABR Jack Graney chapter here in Cleveland, Ohio. And whether you're a SABR member or a guest of SABR, we're most happy and welcome to have you tonight in what I think without a doubt will be a very interesting and informative next hour and a half or 2 hours. Our theme tonight for the meeting is about players of the future, identifying, signing, and developing. And we have three excellent speakers. I'd like to just kind of briefly share kind of the game plan for tonight and then introduce them in more detail and get out of the way and let them have their conversations with you. We're going to start tonight with a little bit of a stroll down memory lane and a looking back of what scouting used to be when the Tom Greenwades and the Cy Slapnikas and others were household names if you were big baseball fans to some degree, to where we are today and where the sport is going in the future. And we're quite privileged tonight to have a person I've got to know a little bit, Dr. Chris Phillips from Carnegie Mellon University. And so Chris is going to do the first part with us tonight. And I know from having seen his charts and read his book that I'll talk about just a bit in a minute, that he's got some really interesting things to say and share and talk about. And then we're going to pivot to the Cleveland Indians and two people, Sam Giller, who is the assistant director for baseball operations, and Clint Longenecker, who is the assistant director of amateur scouting. And the focus will be on the recently completed 2021 draft and the Indians' 21 selections. And they're going to kind of pull the curtain back a little bit and talk to us about how that draft unfolded, the players to some degree, although the 21 players could take a lot of time to talk about, but the future and how they're going to develop those players. And so I think that we're going to really have some good time together tonight. This is a meeting that candidly we had planned to do face-to-face at the Akron Rubber Duck Stadium back in May of 2020, but we all know what happened that prevented that. But I do want to thank these three gentlemen in advance because they didn't throw in the towel. They stayed with us and said, let's try to see what we can do in 2021. So I think we're going to have a great time tonight with them. A little bit on logistics. First, this meeting is being recorded per SABR method of doing business, and it will be posted later on the SABR YouTube channel. And as far as interacting with the speakers, they've all said they would desire this to be more than asynchronous presentations. They'd like to engage in dialogue. So we have two shots at that, two approaches to that. One, we can you can take yourself off of mute, and at any time during the presentation or during the Q&A, and there will be a Q&A for each and perhaps one at the end for the group, you can ask a question. I would only ask two things. If you do take yourself off mute, please first identify yourself so we can make it a little more personal of an exchange, and try to make your question brief and to the point so we give everybody a chance. But for those of us who really would rather use the chat box, that's available also. And we will be watching the chat box and make sure if you put a question in there, it will get the attention of the appropriate speaker. So with that, let us get rolling. As I said, our first speaker to talk about the history and the current state of affairs of scouting and maybe a little bit look to the future is Dr. Chris Phillips, Associate Professor of History at Carnegie Mellon University. And I just want to read one sentence here from Chris's bio. He teaches the history of science, where he researches the history of data and statistics, and in particular, the spread of mathematical models and methods into new fields. And certainly baseball is one of them. And Chris has written an excellent book called Scouting and Scoring, How We Know What We Know About Baseball. And he didn't put me up to this. I just want to say I've read the book not once, but twice. I think it is a truly insightful, interesting book, and it'll be somewhat the basis of what Chris shares with us tonight. So Chris, I'll hand the SABR microphone over to you.
All right, am I sharing okay there?
Sure looks good.
All right, success. a rare Zoom success. So I want to thank Joe for the invitation, and I'm very pleased to be talking about both the past and the future of amateur scouting today as we think about the recent draft. As Joe suggested, this comes out of the book I wrote a couple years ago called Scouting and Scoring, How We Know What We Know About Baseball. And the premise of the book was basically that we think of scouting and scoring as very different sorts of activities. One's about numbers and analytics, one's objective data. The other one, depending on where you stand, tends to be about bodies, about subjective judgments, about guesses, more, less data perhaps, and more intuition or hunches. And I suspected that actually, historically, that just wasn't the case, that historically the two practices were much more similar than different. That is to say, people doing the scoring tended to rely on subjective judgments. They needed people, they needed expertise, they needed institutions. And the people doing the scouting frequently needed numbers. They needed ways of actually measuring, tools, scientific tools of making sense of these messy bodies in space. And so the book takes amateur scouting as a kind of test case. Part of the reason why it takes amateur scouting is, of course, if you're advanced scouting or you're scouting other professional players, you have a lot of data that exists, whereas amateur scouting has relatively little data, or at least data that is quite different in nature than if you're looking at someone who, for instance, plays on another rival team. So that's the premise of the book. And what I essentially want to get into today briefly is the way in which, if you actually look at what scouts do, what they do is a lot of bureaucratic judgment expressed in written form. That is to say that they tell great stories about finding players, but that on the ground, what they're actually doing is turning those judgments into numbers. They're turning those judgments into what seemed to be a kind of objective evaluation. The most common one historically that everyone will be familiar with is what a player is worth. So this is a scouting report from 1987 of Tom Farrick, who at that point was a very, very senior scout, doing a national cross-check on Craig Biggio from Seton Hall. And of course, one of the key elements of this is simply reducing the overall judgment to a single number. And there's a couple we'll talk about, but the one I wanted to highlight here is that he thought he was worth about $55,000 to $60,000 in 1987, just before the draft. And so how do we get to this point? Why are they expressing it in this way? And more to the point, why does this kind of thing exist at all, right? What is it about scouting such that we get this kind of data production? Most of you will know that scouting goes back to the early part of the century. By 1910, every club had a scouting force, as they called it, of veteran players, whose duty was to scour the country, seeking men who by their playing show promise. Scouting comes from the French word to listen, écouter. And of course, it was from the act of sending people ahead in the military to listen, spies, to listen for intelligence. But in baseball, the metaphor most people used for it was vision. That is to say, people who can pick out, who see better, who can project into the future, who can see things that other people can't. And so scouts existed for well over a century, but for most of the first half of the for all of the first half of the 20th century, I should say, and well into the second half, the main role of scouts was actually to put, as they say, a dollar sign on the muscle. That is to say, to connect a player with a dollar figure. And so I give an example of a scouting report here from 1964 that is essentially a letter from Herb Stein, a senior scout with the Twins. And essentially he's writing to the executive offices describing his evaluation of Rod Carew. And he describes it in ways that you can find this in lots of scouts reports from the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. I've seen this boy in a number of games. The following evaluation is submitted. Physically has a fine body, he's wiry, no known injuries, etc. And the key thing is that he thinks he's worth about $5,000. I'm prepared to offer him that and have a good chance of signing him for that. Some of you may know he had a good chance of signing him because he took him out to dinner the night before they could sign at midnight and didn't let him leave until he had signed after midnight. So that's part of the reason why he had a very good chance of signing the prospect at that point. But another reason he had a good chance of signing him is that he had a long paper trail as he had watched Rod Carew play. And in fact, from the perspective of someone like Herb Stein, Rod Carew was a good bet. And part of the reason why he was a good bet is that he was a relatively low cost with high upside. And that was the main role for scouts in the period between 1900 and the early 1960s. Find players with a lot of potential that you can sign cheaply. As you might imagine, if you had a lot of money, you didn't have to go this route. You could just find the best player available, right? And sign them to whatever it cost. And so there was a major difference in strategy as you move between clubs. And there was a fair amount of inequality between clubs. This is known sometimes in the kind of history of scouting world as the golden age of scouting, but partly that's because there was a lot of pressure between scouts to try and land the best prospects. This is a period, some of you may know that the bonus rule was variously in effect. That is to say, trying to penalize teams for giving high bonuses to potential players to try and keep down the cost of hiring players. And this is also the period, I'm sure everyone knows, of the reserve clause. And so the main cost of player acquisition was upfront. Once you had signed players to a club, you could just keep them in the minors for as long as you wanted, pending the Rule 5 draft. But essentially, you could keep them in the minors for as long as you wanted. And so the goal was to try and sign as many players as cheaply as possible, stockpile them. And then as general managers like Branch Rickey would say, you ripen them into money. You essentially wait until they show themselves worth it, and then you can either sell them or promote them. And so the main job of scouts in this period was that $5,000. It was labeling a player with a cost that would be acceptable to the player so that he'd sign with the club, but low enough that the club was willing to take that risk on a player that, of course, very few people in the executive office had presumably ever seen. This was known among scouts, at least, as selling a club to a player. That is to say, what you were doing is what Herb Stein was doing when he took Rod Carew out to dinner that night was selling the Twins as an organization to Rod Carew as a player at the cost of $5,000. So that was the kind of infrastructure of scouting by and large in this kind of early to mid-century period. Things changed dramatically with the institution of the draft in 1965. We can talk about the draft and the kind of origins of the draft. One way to think about the draft is essentially a majority of the clubs force it through because what it effectively does, and it does for over 20 years, is keep the cost of signing players quite manageable. It's not until the late 1980s that the bonuses offered to players in real money match those that were given in the early 1960s. And so it's very, very effective at keeping your kind of initial outlay for players consistent across the 70s and 80s. And for scouting, for what I want to talk about it here, thinking about scouting as a kind of practice of trying to make rigorous, reliable judgments, one of the things it does is de-emphasize pricing. And it de-emphasizes pricing pretty dramatically. Because, of course, if you're drafted and you choose not to sign with the team, you lose an entire year of playing baseball. And so there's a lot of incentive, of course, to try and match the right sort of players at the right level of the draft. And so you can actually pay them. At this point, there were very few limits on what you had to pay players, but rather what they did in the first years of the draft is that if you drafted in an early round, you were assigned to the major league club. And as you move down the draft, you would be assigned to the minor league clubs. And so they did this to try and actually keep teams from shenanigans, where they would try and draft somebody early or late that was different from their actual quality as a player. From the perspective of talent acquisition, though, if you imagine yourself as a general manager in 1965, 1966, your task is very different. In 1964, you sent a group of scouts out with a budget, and the scouts could sign as many people as they possibly could given that budget. And so your goal was to try and spend the budget wisely. But by 1966, your goal is very different. Now you have to fulfill 20, 30 rounds of a draft, which means you have to know a lot more about players that you might not have ever thought you would have to draft. That is to say, what happens after you get through the 15, 20, 30, 100 top prospects? What happens with these later rounds of the draft? And the bottom line is that clubs now had to decide among thousands of players in a very different way, because the guys you had your eye on might be taken in an early round of the draft. On the flip side, scouts themselves had to also evaluate thousands of players, because it was no longer being a broker between a club and a player. Now, as a scout, what you really had to do is provide data on the players and allow the clubs to make a draft pick on that basis. So to think of it, you're no longer selling the club to the player. Now you're selling the player to the club. And this distinction was made by Kevin Carrain in the early 1980s in this wonderful history of scouting, where he's looking at this transition. Suffice it to say, scouts were not happy about this. Scouts, in fact, most interviews with scouts in the 80s and 90s is essentially like a prolonged therapy session about how the draft has ruined the way they do business effectively. And basically old timers until the 21st century were still complaining about the good old days before the draft. You can see the effect of the shift if you look at the scouting manuals. And so one of the things I did was to kind of dig up scouting manuals before and after the draft and see what scouts were told in these manuals. Whether they read them or not, historians don't know, but what they might be told in the manuals. And the manuals shifted from a focus on judgments about money to judgments about objectivity. That is to say, now the focus is much more on getting the right numbers put on the players than about making the judgment about what a player is worth. And so Philadelphia talked about avoiding contact with other scouts, and so you wouldn't have clustering of the numbers you put on players. Texas talked about objectivity being more important than good judgment. Chicago similarly talked about scouts as diggers, that is to say, as data gatherers. Not surprisingly, this was also the era in which pooled scouting began. That is to say, if you have, say, only a dozen or 2 dozen scouts, as was quite common in this period, the idea of going out and seeing enough prospects to fill 20 or 30 rounds of the draft was just overwhelming. And so while pooled scouting had been pushed by Branch Rickey and Jim Gallagher and others in the early 1960s, they really took off after the draft. And so the first pooled scouting organization was the Central Scouting Bureau under Jim Fanning of Milwaukee. This lasted only about a year and a half, actually. It was begun, Cleveland was an initial member of it, as was Pittsburgh, as was Chicago. Basically, the teams that didn't want to pony up for enough scouts were the initial members of the Central Scouting Bureau. But it fell apart pretty quickly, partly because Jim Fanning was hired as Montreal's general manager, and so it lost its leader. But it also fell apart pretty quickly because there was not enough buy-in from the clubs. And so it took a few more years until 1974, when the Major League Scouting Bureau, or the MLSB, was created under Jim Wilson and Don Priest, and which has continued to exist, although its specific roles have changed fairly dramatically over time. And the idea was exactly the same. That is to say, to provide reports on prospects that might be outside the catchment area of the individual clubs so that they would know how to do the draft, essentially. A lot of general managers after summer 1965 were talking about how they just didn't know how to do this draft thing. They didn't know whether they should see the best players or not just ignore the best players, whether they should try and see as many as possible. They didn't know how to do it. And so the Major League Scouting Bureau made it possible. The clubs took different approaches to this. So some clubs like Milwaukee would essentially farm out all the kind of later rounds to the Scouting Bureau, and they would only send their scouts to the top prospects. Other clubs would do the exact opposite. They would use their scouts as a kind of double check, if you will, on the top prospects, but actually spend more time looking at the later rounds prospects. The thing I want to talk about briefly, though, today is how this changes the way scouts actually gathered information. And perhaps the biggest change is that information now had to be standardized. And so you can no longer send a letter to your general manager. Now you had to share data across all the scouts for an organization. And if you were a part of the Central Scouting Bureau or the Major League Scouting Bureau, you had to share it across all or most of the member organizations. And so you can see immediately the change in the scouting reports. Now the scouting report is numbered in the upper left-hand corner, so you can keep track of it. In the upper right-hand corner, it's a little hard to see, but there's holes punched for the positions, so you can gather together all the data on one position very quickly. On the lower left-hand side, you can see the hole punched for definite prospect, good prospect, chance major leaguer, potential prospect, etc. And so all of a sudden now the emphasis is on gathering data together, on making judgments on the basis of a collection of data. And so the other thing you can see here is that the teams really wanted to standardize scouts' judgments. So no longer did they ask you to describe how a player bats. Now they give you terms like good swing, good risks, good wrists, good contact, and they ask you to circle the relevant details. That is to say, they ask you to standardize the kinds of judgments you're making so that you can compare judgments across scouts and then compare judgments across prospects. And so this is a very different form of bureaucratic management of scouting expertise that comes directly after the draft. And you can imagine, of course, that the role of computers and the role of numbers in particular really takes off. And so by 1974, the Major League Scouting Bureau, one of their real innovations was the use of networked computers in the mid-1970s. And so they would share data across networked computers. This was one of their original model reports that they released in 1974. And you can, I'll point out a couple of the details on this, but some of the obvious things are that it's a computer printout and that numbers here are kind of at the center of the actual report. Although it's worth knowing that actually the physical descriptions never go away. And maybe we'll hear from our colleagues in current day scouting as to whether they see some changes moving forward with this kind of persistence of what might be considered judgments that are hard to render in numbers or easy to render in numbers in this way. The major innovation of the Major League Scouting Bureau was the promotion of the overall future potential. That is to say, the OFP, the single number here that the OFP created was considered essential for the draft. So you can imagine if you're a general manager, you don't want to know that somebody's a good prospect. That doesn't help you. What you really need to know is who has the highest number overall. That is, who do you draft first? Knowing that you have 30 good prospects for pitchers does not help you choose among them. But knowing that you can put a set of pitchers in rank order from lowest to highest is what helps you. And so the Major League Scouting Bureau recognized that these ways of networked sharing of numerical judgments would be very, very helpful for clubs. The calculation is kind of embarrassing. It shows you a little bit about what they thought of the numerical abilities of scouts at the period. They went into some detail to explain how to take an average of numbers. And so the original overall future potential would be you take the average of your future judgments, and then you can adjust it up or down based on what individual scouts would think of as intangibles. And we can get into some of the rules for this if people are interested in this. But the basic idea is that you would turn an overall judgment into a single number. And we should be familiar with this, right? This is the modern world. Are you a good person? We can turn it into a number, right? Your risk of a heart attack, your risk of defaulting on credit, right? This is how we operate in the modern world. And indeed, it was how scouts operated after the Major League Draft. Almost immediately, the Major League Scouting Bureau report was adopted widely by clubs. And so by the end of the 1970s, almost all clubs are using some version of the Major League Scouting Bureau report. And you can see on each of the reports, if you dig into them, that they're using essentially the same scale between 2 and 8. Numerical scales had been used before as well, I should say. Numerical scales weren't invented by the Major League Scouting Bureau, but they did invent the 2 to 8 scale, which I've always thought, I don't know if anyone has thoughts on this, but I've always thought it was because the SAT, which was coming into prominence in the same period, used the 200 to 800, which was always scaled to 500 as the national norm. And so I thought it had to be connected, but I will tell you what, no scout ever admitted to it, and I could find no evidence that this is the case, but that is my secret hunch that has zero data behind it. But you can see now that on these reports, the overall future potential is at the very top. This is the major number. This is the way you organize your reports. It doesn't mean you have to go from largest to smallest, but it does mean you could go from largest to smallest number in this way. There's other judgments we could get into. The stopwatch has been used since the early part of the century by scouts. The radar gun was turned towards the pitching mound in 1975, 74, excuse me, into 75. And so gun readings became common in this period. And other kinds of technologies were used. So the national double check or cross checkers, which had been pioneered by Baltimore under Jim McLaughlin, became widely used by the Major League Scouting Bureau and then were copied by other teams. And you can see a couple other of these innovations of the 1970s, like the use of aptitude and psychometric tests. So they again go back to the Army Alpha from World War I. But by the 1970s, they were turning this kind of test to athletes, and in particular to try and find ways to quantify who might be the right sort of prospects. And of course, they also provided medical history. So the first medical exams, standardized medical exams, were also given in the 1970s, again pioneered by the Major League Scouting Bureau. So part of the point I want to make here is that this kind of modern infrastructure of scouting really developed in response to this transition from putting a number or a dollar sign on the muscle to transitioning to actually trying to make your data move between people, make your data commensurate between scouts, to make sure that if you have a different report from the Major League Scouting Bureau, you use the same scale so that you can actually compare players. So there's a huge amount of effort that actually went into making this kind of data, these sorts of reports work together. That is to say, to make scouts into kind of data-driven operation. And many of these things remained long after kind of transformations in the Major League Scouting Bureau. There's an important point here as well that we might want to consider, that these reports were not just about data for the players, but they also generated data on scouts. And so the clubs, of course, could keep the reports to see how well scouts were doing over time. That is to say, if you said we should definitely pass on Craig Biggio, he is not worth it, we should get somebody else, that before this point, it would just mean that you didn't offer the right amount of money and the Yankees swooped in or the Cardinals swooped in and took the player. But after you have these kinds of reports, now general managers could go back and say, why did you give this guy a 60? Why not a 55? Why not a 70? That is to say, you could use this kind of data also to judge scouts as well. And so it could be useful in both ways. And so scouts became a kind of part of these larger bureaucratic, technocratic organizations in a real way. And of course, the vast majority of people who scouts saw would not be drafted by the team. And so you better have ways of evaluating scouts besides looking at who actually you draft from scouts, because that's going to be a very small part of what any individual scout might do. So one of the things I really try and emphasize is that by the 1980s, scouts are complaining about how numerical, how scientific scouting has become. And they're not talking about Bill James, right? This is not some sort of Moneyball critique, right? This is that my own darn team has turned what I have done into this numbers game, right? It's like too scientific. And that's a real transition. It's a very interesting transition by the 1980s. And so what you have here is this sense that scouts may always talk about themselves as a kind of gatherer of stories, as a kind of good old boy going down the roads, trying to find the right sort of person. But what they're actually doing is filling out complex bureaucratic reports for a major corporation that is going to make sense of those reports in order to try and make money. And that is precisely what they're doing, in line with every other major American corporation in the 1980s. And so one of the things I really want to do is push against this idea of the kind of romance that sometimes we hear in these stories. And the Major League Scouting Bureau, at least I would say, is really the key organization pushing this technology of standardization. That is to say, how do you make these judgments objective? I should be very clear, not all the judgments are good just because you put them in numerical form. So, we can talk about how it doesn't make your judgments right. It just standardizes them or calibrates them in a certain way, but it doesn't guarantee that you draft the right players or develop the players, I say, without any judgment coming from Pittsburgh. And so one of the things you see after the 1980s is that the Major League Scouting Bureau continues to innovate in these ways. It was the first bureau to use video, and it also had the Scout School to further calibrate. So this just gives you a sense of how scouts talk about what they do. This is not, I would say, what they actually do, but it's how they talk about it. These books are almost all the same. There's one chapter per acquisition, and they always have to go to some god-awful place, stay in a bad hotel, and wash their clothes in the sink. And then they find this guy that no one else has seen. And it's a great story. I've read all of these, but I think it's easy to forget that really what they're doing is they're putting data on particular players. And of course, goes without saying that I think we're aware of this kind of old school, new school debate over the last 20 years. And what I'll end on is just, I think of scouting as a data-driven science. And that's one of the things as a historian of science I think about a lot, is that we tend to think of science as like fundamental equations or experiments, but actually the vast majority of science is about collecting data, aggregating it, statistically analyzing it, making predictions, adjusting your model, and iterating. And that's precisely what happened to scouting after the draft. That's precisely how you judge whether your scouting department is working, is that you see whether in fact you're improving as you collect and aggregate data. To be fair, what they do is very, very hard, as we'll hear about these prospects in a second. And up until the 2010s, only about 8% of draftees ever played a day in the major leagues. And really, it was closer to only about 45% of first rounders, I believe, until the 21st century, although I think the data might have changed more recently. But the last I saw was about 45% of first rounders. So that's terrible if what you're trying to do is make reliable predictions about the future. But it's often the best that can be done. So just a quick thanks, mainly to the SABR Scouting Committee and to a number of people who helped me along the way. And I'll turn it back over for questions or to hear from our other speakers. So Thanks very much.
Yeah, we've got some time for questions, either in the chat box or going off mute. Well, let me throw one at you, Chris. You talked a little bit about the I'll call it the mental aspects of a player. Going forward, what's your thought about as more and more science is devoted to that area? How do you see that being possibly done? More numbers driven, so to speak, going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to hear from our current experts as well. But as a historian, I'm always a little bit nervous about saying what's going to be in the future. But I do think one of the things you see a lot of in the late 20th and early 21st century was less mental and more physical measurement. That is to say, trying to predict when bodies will break down, being incredibly important. It's still very difficult, and most of the techniques seem to be pretty bad. But I think that's actually gone a lot further along this line than, in fact, mental testing has gone. Mental testing is very, very difficult. One of my favorite lines from scouts using mental tests is that they thought the best thing about it was that they got into the players' homes and actually got to see what players' homes were like, because it took a while to administer these tests. And so they found the real value in trying to kind of back create or infer what the mental status of the players might be from just being in their home and administering a test, as opposed to the actual results of the test. At least until the 21st century, general managers were very, very divided, let's say, on the worth of some of these athletic motivation inventory type exams. But the Major League Scouting Bureau definitely continued to administer them. It's better to have the data, they figured, and ignore it than to not have the data at all.
Okay. Well, so a question, Chris, a question in the chat box, two questions actually. Are you okay with making your PowerPoint slides available to the group tonight?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
It'll be posted on YouTube, so there's no reason why I can't find a way to facilitate it.
I will put my email address in the chat box, and anybody who wants it, please just email me and I'll get it to you the next day or so, hopefully less than a day. And then a question from Steve Johnson: does character play any part in a scout's evaluation in the new era? If so, how do they go about measuring character?
So I didn't talk about the good face, which is the like old old moniker for a lot of things, but character among them. Partly because I think there's an overemphasis on this kind of, looking into somebody's eyes and seeing just, whether they're going to be able to throw that high and tight fastball or not. When in fact, I think there's a lot of other ways to do it. But one of the things I was really interested in is they've tried in the 70s, and a lot of different clubs did this in different ways. So there was the Royals Academy for a while. There was kind of different shortcut mechanisms that everyone tried to use to figure out how to get to character. So one of the things you would try and do is find somebody who's exhibited character in some way and then turn them into a ball player, or to try and really generate it as part of the scouting process. And so there's kind of lots of stories about, again, scouts love to talk about this, whether they sort of, talk to somebody's teammate and tell them a lie. Like I saw him step down in a fight. So Tom Glavine and the Atlanta Braves talk about this in the memoirs of the 1990s, that they would spread rumors about, Chipper Jones stepping down before a fight, and they'd see if anyone on the team would challenge it, to try and get to character. But these things are very, very hard to get to. And from what I've seen, actually, there's much less emphasis on this until very, very, throughout the 20th century than scouts might give you the impression of if you read their memoirs.
Okay. I think I cut somebody off who was about to ask. Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Have you analyzed through the evolution of scouting how the results have worked? I'm presuming that it's more cost efficient nowadays, video, etc. But is the end product better? And do you have any evidence or any research that shows, are they getting guys being more effective? You talked about 45% of first rounders not making it. Are there any concrete numbers that back that up or prove one way or the other if the evolution of scouting has been more successful?
Yeah, so you can do this. So teams have done this. There's actually, there's an excellent essay using overall future potential across, because what you can do is you can just go back and use something like overall future potential, like OFP, and just track. You can just try and see, you can do a correlation. You can be pretty basic with your statistical analysis, and you can either look at, the OFP to who gets drafted or OFP to how they perform at the major league level. People have done it. The problem, though, is that the number of successes is so low that almost any measurement, any statistical measurement, it's going to be in the air. That is to say, like any improvement, you're dealing with going from like 6% to 7% to, it's an exceedingly hard thing. And so if you're a critic of scouting in the 20th century, you would say this is all a show. That is to say, it's an elaborate show of numbers, but actually in the end, it's like, I like the guy, I know his pops, he's got the major league body, let's just draft him, no matter what numbers are given. But, it's, to my view, first of all, that ignores the fact of how much money is at stake in these decisions. Why would, that'd be an incredibly bad way of doing things. And I think there is something to be said for the real value of a lot of these objectivity kind of generators are not for the first few rounds. They're for how you deal with 4th round to the 30th round. And in that sense, having a way of actually making judgments that are not just kind of tossing a coin or, going with the last person you saw make a lot of sense. And so there isn't a lot of data about change over time, but part of that's because it's just an exceedingly difficult job.
Yeah, because it seems like originally it was throw out the blanket, get tons of, all these guys, you're signing guys, and you're going to hit some players.
Yeah.
And clearly that changed. And like I say, I think it's as much financially driven as anything.
Yeah. Well, and I hope we hear from the two Joe Shaws, about, a little bit about that, because I think it is, there's a lot of investment in player development, suggesting that actually it's after you draft them that really the major work happens. The clubs have different philosophies on this. One of the things I intentionally did as a historian was not make it about they're bad or they're good, but instead of say, what are they trying to do? They spend a lot of money on this and a lot of time. And so what are they actually doing? What do they think works? There's enough people out there to second guess draft picks. I didn't need to throw my name into that particular arena.
Thanks for the answers. Great stuff.
Yeah. Any other questions for Chris? All right.
I have
Chris-
a question.
Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, in my mind, baseball drafting and hockey drafting are very similar because you're looking at young players, right? Immature physically players, and you're trying to project them into a skill set where they're, adult and mature. Have you looked at the success rate of hockey drafting against baseball drafting to see if it's really, if it's close? Because when you think of the NBA and the NFL, right, they're drafting people right into the big leagues, right? So they've got a much better sense for how that player fits into the way they play the game today. Where when you look at a baseball or hockey player, you're looking at least 3 years from the time you draft them to the time they actually get to the big league. So I'm just kind of curious if you looked at it or you've spoken to anybody who's on the hockey side that has looked at that.
I really haven't. I looked at a little bit at comparisons for drafting because baseball was the last major sport to have a draft. And so, there's a longer time in baseball where you have, clubs having set in their ways, shall we say. And so it takes them a long time to figure out how to do the draft, essentially compared to some of these other sports. There's also the gap. I have no idea, but the gap for college to pro in baseball is really still wide. And I suspect that hockey college to pro is somewhat narrower, but I enjoy hockey, but I have no idea if that's true. But baseball is so wide, it's hard to imagine hockey is as wide as baseball is. And so, that I haven't looked into the comparison. What I will say, though, is scouts have a really wonderful way of talking about projecting bodies. And there's all sorts of these like crazy but lovely heuristics about how they do this. And so you'll find people like, well, you got to sit in this one spot between home and first, and you got to look at this. And so, one of the things I didn't talk about today, but I go into some detail, probably too much detail in the book, is that, the different ways people think that they can see the adult version of a player. Because that's ultimately what you don't care.
Yeah.
If someone's the best guy on the field and they're 18, they're never going to be a top major leaguer, unless they're playing against incredibly good competition. So you don't want somebody who's peaking. You actually want somebody with a lot of upside if they're looking at them when they're 16, 18. Someone's peaking, then it's going to be not good moving forward. So it's a good question about hockey, though. So I just don't know the answer.
Okay. Any last question for Chris? I would ask you to pay attention to the really interesting commentary that Ann Enos put into the chat box. Fascinating. Thank you, Ann. That's really cool. So any last questions? All right, Chris, thank you very much, but hang with us, please. So let's turn our attention to the Indians now, and I'm really pleased to introduce, as I said, Sam Giller, who is the Assistant Director for Baseball Operations for the current Indians. And prior to coming to the Cleveland franchise, he worked for MLB in the labor relations and league economics and strategy area. And he's a graduate of Kenyon College with a BA in economics. And his colleague here, Mr. Clint Longenecker, who has been with the tribe for over 6 years, currently the Assistant Director of Amateur Scouting for the Indians. And prior to coming to Cleveland, he was the assistant editor for Baseball America in tracking the yearly baseball draft. And he has an MBA in finance and marketing from Rollins College. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. And we're anxious to take a peek behind that draft screen.
Very much, Joe. As Joe mentioned, my name is Clint Longenecker, and I can't tell you how appreciative I am of the opportunity to spend an evening together with you guys discussing the draft. We definitely want this to be interactive and are looking forward to your questions. A word of warning, I'll say here, the microphone on my computer has been temperamental recently. So if you're unable to hear me, please jump in, audibly or let me know with a hand gesture. A big thank you to Dr. Phillips. Your presentation was absolutely fascinating, and I absolutely learned a lot. The themes of scouting, it's pretty remarkable how similar they are despite the different eras, spanning decades. You mentioned Don Prees, who was the longtime scouting director for the Major League Scouting Bureau, and we actually drafted his grandson, Micah Prees, out of Point Loma Nazarene in 2019. He's actually an outfielder for us at the high A level. Earlier, Ken asked a question about the overall efficacy of scouting historically. And in the modern era, going back to like the late 1990s, so the rate of first rounders who made the major leagues has actually improved over time. Depending upon where you draw the line, it's somewhere between 60 and 66% overall. So there has been an improvement over time. And this goes to show what a small world it is. Ray Fagman is actually a very good friend. I just saw him in San Diego last week for the area code games. It's always fun to run into Ray.
He's been there for a long time with the Red Sox.
He really has. He's been a staple. Mr. Red Sox.
Right.
So Sam and I are really excited to walk you through basically a review of the 2021 draft, which just completed about a month ago. In many ways, the 2021 draft was the most unique in modern scouting history and faced more year-over-year changes than any other draft kind of within the modern landscape. So by the end of the session, we definitely want to share on 4 primary topics: the draft infrastructure at a league-wide level, a review of our draft, highlight some of the top selections for our organization, and then share how that group of players from the 2021 class has been onboarded in the organization. So before we get into the specifics of the 2021 class, we want to zoom out briefly and share why drafting and development is really critical for our organizational success. And I apologize if any of this is elementary, but wanted to kind of start at the macro level before we zoom in, more specifically and deliberately. So while every organization does say that scouting is the lifeblood of their organization, it truly has to be for us to be competitive and achieve our goals of winning the World Series. We face a lot of changes, with 3 very prominent ones. With us being a small market club, we actually are one of the smallest markets in all of Major League Baseball, and actually have the smallest market with any city that has a MLB, NBA, and NFL team. So there is some cannibalization within the market itself for consumer dollars. And while the organization does receive some revenue sharing, it's certainly not enough to put us on an even playing field financially with big market clubs with much deeper pockets. And with MLB not having a salary cap, that means that other clubs cannot spend us and really flex their financial muscle, specifically within free agency. When we made it to the Game 7 of the World Series in 2016, we had the lowest Major League payroll of any playoff club that year, and since then have spent nearly $100 million less than our playoff foes on average compared to that really competitive group. So since Terry Francona became our Major League manager in 2013 as well, our average payroll has been more than $140 million less than the top spending team in the American League each year. In 2021, we also have the second lowest payroll and the lowest in the American League. So acquiring top talent in free agency simply presents a huge challenge for our organization. Additionally, with the way the draft ends up working, we are somewhat penalized by the fact that we've had success at the Major League level. So from 2013 to 2020, we won more games in the American League than any other club. And because of that success, we've had to pick later and later. We've only had 1 top 10 selection over that time, which came in 2013 as a result of a very poor 2012 season. And since then, our cumulative bonus pool, which is set by Major League Baseball, is actually the 9th lowest of any team. So by winning at the Major League level, our access to those most talented players in the draft is somewhat limited. So those challenges really bring us to the heart of the discussion today, which is why selecting and developing players is so important for us. I mean, simply put, it is our best opportunity to acquire and develop talent that's going to impact us for multiple years at the Major League level. And since there are a few different avenues for acquiring players for a professional organization, we just want to briefly differentiate the different means of player procurement. First, we have the amateur draft and international amateurs and also pro acquisitions. So the draft spans players who are high school seniors, college players who are juniors, seniors, or 21 years or older, and also players from junior colleges based in US, Puerto Rico, and Canada. So this is traditionally referred to as amateur scouting and the focus of our session today. Amateur players from the rest of the world are considered to be international amateurs, namely from Latin America, Europe, Asia. So this is traditionally referred to as international scouting. These players sign contracts independent of the domestic draft. And then we have pro scouting, which is acquiring players already in professional baseball or partner league through trades, waivers, or free agency. So our charge of acquiring the best talent is an incredibly difficult task, which Dr. Phillips already hit on earlier. And you can imagine as we're trying to predict the future of 17 to 23-year-old young men who are spread across multiple countries and have very different levels of access to coaching, to training, and are just physically growing at very different rates. Furthermore, the scope of the entire player pool is incredibly daunting too. This chart is basically built to show the funnel that leads to selections for the organization. So if we start with basically all draft eligible players in our pool, there's more than 165,000 across high schools, junior colleges, and colleges. And then from there, major league teams end up getting draft IDs on about 7,000 players overall, which enables them to make a selection on draft day. So one quick caveat that this chart does offer more historical perspective than future looking perspective. So in a 40-round draft, there's roughly 1,200 players selected. In a 20-round draft, as we just experienced last month, there are only roughly 600 players selected. So you can see here that the ratios of the eligible pool compared to players selected is pretty staggering. And then from 2012 to 2019, we had roughly 40 selections per draft class, and we ended up signing about 30 players per class. So that means that on average, for every 5,500 draft eligible players who are eligible in the draft, one is going to enter our organization. In a 20-round draft, that goes up to more than 8,000. So the hunt for the best players is really a wide-reaching effort from across our organization, namely the 30 domestic scouts that we have spread all across the country. So our challenge is to draft the best draft class that has the greatest chance of helping impact our major league club. And the scope of the player pool further demonstrates why we need a full year to scout the player pool. Honestly, I can't even imagine what it was like in a prior era when you had the January draft and then the June draft, and you were making selections multiple times per year. So after bringing players into our organization, we have to be excellent in development as well, which Sam is going to touch on later. So this chart shows the historical rates of players at each level of the minor leagues who then went on to advance to the major leagues. And this is even for a single day of major league service. So historically, drafted players have roughly 1 in 50 shot of playing more than 6 full seasons at the major league level and then reaching free agency. So given the very long odds that we've highlighted in the last 2 slides, drafting and developing players, you can see that really any advantage on the margin is really going to be a huge separator for our viability as an organization. Before I go on further and touch more specifically on the 2021 draft, I wanted to stop and see if there were any questions.
None in the chat box, Clint.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So with that organizational context out of the, we wanted to dig into the specifics of the 2021 class, which again, we think is probably the most unique in modern history and probably also the most challenging, particularly the bevy of changes to prior operating norms. So I'm first going to outline these changes or obstacles at a macro level first, such as basically factors that exist for all 30 clubs before sharing how we specifically, the Cleveland Indians, soon to be Guardians, have approached these challenges as an organization. So within the scouting process, as Dr. Phillips discussed, teams are now competing in scouting by acquiring better, more, and unique data on players, but the ability for teams to do so was very much interrupted in 2021 for a variety of reasons. So as a result of the pandemic, MLB instituted a variety of rules over the course of the last 18 months. So we want to go back to the start of the 2021 draft calendar right after the conclusion of the 2020 draft. At that time, Major League Baseball did not allow teams to scout in person, and this was a continuation of the moratorium on in-person scouting that was implemented in mid-March of 2020. While MLB permitted in-person scouting beginning in late June for the first national showcase, which is called Perfect Game National, smaller regional events were played without any scouts and without any video present as well. So it was really tough to get an understanding of what actually happened. So the beginning of the summer wasn't scouted in a typical fashion, costing teams precious looks at and data on the best high school players in the entire class. And then even when the ban on in-person scouting was lifted, only 3 scouts per organization were permitted to attend the same event actually, regardless of the size or the quality of the player pool as well. So some events are played at one single field where 3 scouts can capably cover a game being played, while others are played at huge complexes with dozens of fields where hundreds of games are played on a daily basis. But again, only 3 scouts were allowed to cover those events too. This rule was dropped later in the 2020 spring season, but really governed the first 3 quarters of the draft calendar and presented huge challenges with regard to scheduling. In the past, for some of the most talent-laden events, our organization would have as many as 15 or more scouts go to, devote their time to the best players in the class. We had to be much more precise with who was going to these events and also the information they were able to capture. So getting video on players became much more important because it allowed others to watch who weren't able to attend due to those restrictions, even though in prior years they would have been able to attend. Additionally, Major League Baseball rules didn't allow scouts to hold personal workouts with players. And for these purposes, basically a workout being any time a player was operating outside of the function of his normal team environment. So in the past, workouts were incredibly beneficial to grow scouting history with players, especially for certain types of exposure, whether that be defense, batting practice, or bullpens, and be able to get different vantage points as well. So this restriction was really tough to overcome, but teams started asking players to conduct workouts via video. Major League Baseball has a data sharing platform between players and clubs and began acting as a clearinghouse for these videos and objective data uploaded by players. Workouts were permitted starting in May of 2021 in the spring across the industry, and teams really began to scramble to hold a lot of workouts and make up for this serious deficit in the scouting process. So scouts have also historically conducted in-home visits with players in order to get to know them, to assess their character, to build rapport with the family, especially for those high school players as well, and really better understand their family background. For high school players, this typically means the scouts will drive to the player's home, have a sit-down conversation with the family and the player. For college players, these meetings typically occur at a school's campus without the player's family present. So as an industry, we really had to begin to interview players remotely, such as on Zoom calls, until this ban was lifted in late May of this spring. While it was still functionally effective in getting to know the player, this did present challenges in terms of truly developing relationships with players, understanding their background, and also their interests of wanting to go into pro ball versus college. Additionally, over the last year, the use of video for scouting has also really accelerated, especially as video quality has improved and also has become much more prevalent at the amateur level, specifically with college players. Additionally, the 2020 summer saw unprecedented cancellations of prominent events and also leagues. Now, the spring scouting season is far and away like the most structured and highest profile of the scouting calendar, but the summer is absolutely critical because it's when departments begin accruing history with players. And the scouting calendar often works as a funnel as well, where teams scout a broader swath of players in the summer and then becoming increasingly more targeted over the course of the year. The added benefit of the summer is also the best players are usually playing against one another, as opposed to in the spring when talent is distributed all across the country. This is particularly true for high school players. For example, a high school player from Ohio can play the best high school competition in the summer, but then never face a pitcher in the spring who has any chance of playing professional baseball. So last summer, a lot of the high school showcases were canceled, particularly on the West Coast, and most notably the Team USA 18U program, which typically has the 20 best high school players in the class and usually has about 8 to 10 first-round picks. So in total, the industry lost hundreds of innings and hundreds of at-bats from a scouting sense and also from data acquisition as well. And on the college side, many of the regional summer leagues were also canceled, but the biggest blow really came with when the Cape Cod League and Team USA college national team were canceled. So historically, about 80% of college players who are selected in the top 10 rounds play in one of those two leagues. So that means that most of the best college players in the class went 11 full months without playing games from the first week of March in 2020, right when the season shut down, to the start of the 2021 spring in late February. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of growth and maturation, and guys made huge jumps or receded in their talent. So it was really tough to be able to plan accordingly come the spring. Additionally, the industry typically covets college players based on longer track record relative to high school players, but teams have never had less information on college players, especially entering the spring season, especially on the heels of only having 4 weeks of a college spring. So due to this deficit, teams scouted fall college practices more than ever before, but also there were many schools in regions that didn't have organized team activities due to COVID restrictions, such as Stanford and Cal Berkeley as well, which kind of runs into the next challenge, which was COVID restrictions. So once the spring season started in about February of 2021, COVID was a huge factor in the scouting process for all three demographics. On the high school side, the Canadian junior national team, which typically tours the Southeast for much of the spring and produces really good talent, such as our own Josh Naylor, Bo Naylor, and Cal Quantrill, but the team couldn't play in the spring and cross the border, which sent a lot of those players scrambling to play elsewhere at the last minute. Puerto Rico as well has also faced a similar dynamic this spring. Additionally, for the contiguous U.S., a lot of these spring schedules for many states were both shortened and pushed back much later into the spring. In some cases, by multiple months, and the seasons were cut in half or so. On the college side, there were some extreme measures taken where the Ivy League season was canceled entirely. The Big Ten only played conference games and started 3 weeks late. Additionally, most teams played a lot fewer non-conference games, which presented challenges for evaluating performance and also seeing players against better competition as well. So above and beyond these factors, scheduling was really tough throughout the spring for everyone, for all the scouts, and they really never knew when the next COVID cancellation was going to occur. There are countless examples of scouts driving across multiple states and arriving to watch a game only to find out that it had just been canceled due to a COVID outbreak. Additionally, the 5-round draft in 2020 resulted in only 160 players being selected. When you include the players who non-drafted free agents in that class, that means there were still 850 fewer players who signed in 2020 compared to 2019 and prior years. So that pushed a lot of high school players in the 2020 class to college who'll be eligible in 2023, and a lot of college juniors back to school who were then eligible again in 2021. The NCAA also gave players an extra year of eligibility. So the depth of college players in this year's class was nearly unprecedented, and many improved their stock over the course of the spring as well. Additionally, just from an infrastructure standpoint, the opportunity for acquiring players changed dramatically entering this year. The number of rounds was far and away the biggest departure. So from 2012 to 2019, the draft was 40 rounds, and most teams would sign on average between 32 and 35 players per draft class. For 2021, the number of rounds was cut in half to 20, which really presented challenges for scouts in determining where to spend their time and which players to spend their time on, especially with that huge bottleneck of players left over from the 2020 draft class. We'll touch on the ramifications of this change when we get to the actual draft results. Additionally, non-drafted free agents had a bonus cap of $20,000 placed on them in 2020 and also 2021. So in prior years, teams could spend whatever they wanted to on NDFAs as long as they still abided by the bonus pool rules. This cap really artificially restricted the number of players who were interested in signing for financial reasons. All players selected on day 3 of the draft, which is rounds 11 through 20, can sign for up to $125,000 without it counting against the organization's bonus pool. So the difference in potential earnings from the last pick of the draft to the best undrafted player is a multiplier of 5x. Pretty staggering difference.
Wow.
Yeah. Additionally, the draft infrastructure completely leading up to the actual selections. Well, so for the very first time, Major League Baseball instituted a draft combine at the USA Baseball National Training Complex in Cary, North Carolina. And it really consisted of a variety of beneficial activities such as on-field games, workouts, physical measurements, which we kind of touched on earlier, medical testing, and also in-person interviews. So a huge influx of really helpful information in late June for the very first time. Major League Baseball also partnered with Prep Baseball Report to create the first ever draft league that consisted of 6 former New York Penn League organizations, which were filled with draft eligible players. So Major League Baseball ensured these games were played using modern data and video methods to provide teams with the most and best available information. Additionally, the draft calendar also completely changed for 2021. For the first time ever, the draft was held in July and was done so alongside the All-Star Game festivities from July 11th through the 13th. This is 5 weeks later into the summer than a typical draft, which has implications in a variety of areas. First, teams had the opportunity to scout college players all the way through their season. In prior years, the draft was held during the second round of the postseason, which hurt the player experiences, held up the signing process, and for the teams that advanced deep into the postseason, took away an additional 15 games or so worth of scouting opportunities and data. Additionally, the latter draft date allowed more college underclassmen to become draft eligible because the rules indicate that players who turn 21 within 45 days of the draft can be selected. So we already had a really deep group of college players in the pool from 2020 that was further reinforced by an additional 5 weeks of eligible players, based on birth dates in the draft moving back. So the scouting process also became a lot tougher in the summer because of the importance of the summer schedule for the upcoming year's draft class that we touched on earlier. So before the 2020 draft or 2021 draft was held, the Cape Cod League had already been playing for 3 weeks. A lot of prominent showcases had already been held. So that effectively meant that scouts had to worry about scouting 2 different draft classes at once, 2021 and looking ahead to 2022. Furthermore, scouts and front offices had to prepare for the trade deadline, which was held at the end of July, while simultaneously preparing for the draft. Usually there's about a two-month buffer. In this since there was about a 2-week buffer. So for teams, this was easily the busiest July that we've ever had. Additionally, with the draft date being later, the signing deadline was pushed back to August 1st, directly after the trade deadline. Those were held within 1 day of one another. This was the smallest signing window on record, which means that teams had to be more confident really than ever before in a player's interest in signing, and also cost certainty, was of utmost importance in order to avoid both deadlines basically competing with one another and the precious time associated with both. So as you can see, there's a lot of changes with the draft that are somewhat staggering. So in many ways, scouting as an industry is based on historical norms. So as an organization, we thought that a key differentiator for the 2021 draft and our success is basically how agile teams could be in reacting to the changing industry landscape.
So Clint, before you get off this chart, we've got several questions. First, an observation. I now understand after what you just said why you encouraged me to not hold this meeting until August. Because we have been talking about a July timeframe, and now it all makes sense. Why wait till August? So, but let me go down the questions in order in which they were submitted. First from Jim, is the success rate for first round picks significantly different for pitchers versus fielders, left-handers versus right-handers, and college versus high school? Is there a finer grain probability distribution, I guess, depending on more detailed characteristics of players?
It's an absolutely tremendous question. A lot of it really depends on how you define success. If that's reaching the major leagues or reaching certain levels of production at the major leagues or throughout a player's career. On the whole, fielders or position players do have a better chance of getting to the major leagues relative to pitchers. We've seen the industry norms somewhat adjust, and teams are much less reluctant now to draft pitchers, particularly high school pitchers. That's really where the riskiest, the riskiest demographic, particularly at the top. College versus high school, the rate of college players who make the major leagues is higher than high school players. But when you look at basically average WAR or overall production, it is somewhat similar. So you do have somewhat of a risk versus reward proposition there that somewhat comes out in the wash overall. But again, a lot of that is really just dependent upon how you determine success. And the next question was, do scouts still cover the Alaska League? And unfortunately, the Alaska League was one of those leagues that in the summer of 2020 had a canceled season, but scouts still cover the Alaska League. It is one of the most enjoyable scouting experiences for many, and players absolutely love it as well. It is one of the smallest leagues at, I believe, only 5 teams, but there's still good talent up there. I believe Aaron Judge up there before his draft eligible season. So yeah, it is still a very quality league.
And then the last one there from Rod Nelson, can you see it? It's a little bit of a more lengthy one right below Steve's about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Roderick. And overall, and this is, there's been some articles written about this, but major league organizations are signing players from independent baseball now at a rate that far outstrips any year prior. And we saw that spike right at the start of the season, and also as players begin to incur injuries, and there were gaps basically in organizations' depth charts as well. And I think with what Major League Baseball has done with the advent of a few partner leagues that have really good data and video, the barriers to scouting some of those leagues have also been reduced as well.
Okay, good. Well, you've covered the questions. Thank you.
Gladly. So with all of that context out of the way, it really sets the stage for the industry-wide results of the draft, which is really revealing on a macro level. Also, it's pertinent for our draft class as well. This chart shows the percentage of top 10 round selections dating back to 2010 by every or for every demographic. In many respects, this indicates this most recent draft class is a true outlier and is really carried by the strength of pitching. So in 2021, 58% of all selections were on pitchers compared to a 12-year average of 54%. The previous high of 56% was easily bypassed. And college pitching was really the biggest driver of this trend because a staggering 45% of all picks were spent on college pitchers compared to an average of 37%. So those two trends coincided with 73% of all selections going to college players, which also tied for the most in the sample. So this investment in college pitching, of course, came at the expense of high school players, as well as 8% of picks went to high school position players, which was a modern low, and 11% of selections on high school pitchers was tied for the second lowest rate over this sample. So it really shows the buttressing effect of the 2020 holdover players and the bottleneck that occurred. So those were some of the main highlights, but wanted to stop here to see if anybody in the group had questions about this slide or any other takeaways that stand out.
Well, we're not seeing anything in the chat box either. That's
right.
really interesting. Wow.
So as we just touched on with that huge bottleneck of players from the 20 class, it really had a dramatic impact on selections. So 49% of all college players selected were considered seniors or COVID juniors who have been out of college for four seasons. This is more than twice the rate of the average draft class. Additionally, more than 1/3 of all players selected were college seniors, which again is more than 2.5 times the average as well. So the average age also of the group of players signing and matriculating to professional baseball is higher than it has also been in this sample due to the investment in older players also. A few nuggets that wanted to highlight on a macro level. First, we talked about basically the rates of high school players was down, and also just the total number of high school players that were drafted and signed really fell dramatically in this class as teams prioritized college players. So this means that the influx into college baseball over the last 2 drafts is truly at an all-time high and is going to have a significant ripple effect for future years. And also amid domestic roster limits and the 20 rounds of the draft for the first time heading in, nobody really knew how many players would actually be signed. But for the most part, drafted players signed. So there were only 3 players in the top 10 rounds who didn't sign, and roughly 40 players from rounds 11 through 20 didn't sign either. So overall, 93% of selected players ended up, matriculating to professional baseball. And of those 46 unsigned players, nearly 2/3 were from high school, roughly 1/3 was from college, and then the remainder was from a junior college level. So teams average about 23 players signed per draft class, including and the NDFAs. There's a pretty narrow range there with Boston at the low end, and then almost everybody else was in the 20s. But then the Angels signed 39, so they were the extreme outlier there. All but one team did end up signing an NDFA, with teams averaging 4 on the whole. So interestingly, there were basically 127 NDFAs signed this year, which is nearly half of last year's total. So again, we're seeing the impact of the round difference, show up in that level of investment. So I will pass it over to Sam at this point, and he's going to dig into the fun stuff and really discuss the specifics of our draft class, unless there was a.
Yeah, there are a couple questions in the chat box for you from Chris and Andrew.
Okay, great. Chris, it's a absolutely great question. I think heading into the draft class, we thought that college was going to be far and away the deepest group, and that was reflected within like industry lists, whether it be from Baseball America, ESPN. But I think beyond that, there had been probably more teams that had that felt better about their position player groups at the minor league level, and you had to be much more precise. So if you needed an infielder, you know, for example, you know, you were going to have to you know, invest a greater selection as opposed to just like drafting a pitcher because of the differences in roles. But I also think going back to the impact of last year's summer, the fact that hitters or the college hitters didn't hit with the wood bat or against the best competition in the Cape also within models and evaluations probably reduced the confidence within certain demographics relative to pitching. And additionally, I think that because most players did have basically 12 months off from pitching, they were able to invest more time in strength training, velocity training as well. So compared to prior norms, they probably showed better. And I'm honestly not sure if teams, because of like kind of the 1 year blip, had enough data to really kind of normalize for those differences as well. We did see a lot of teams, you know, go pitching heavy, but there were a few outliers where teams went, you know, really position player heavy as well. The reduction with drafted players, I think there's a ton of different factors. One thing that I didn't touch on earlier was moving the draft date back allowed for a lot of high school players to go to the schools to which they were committed for the summer, begin practices, taking classes. So I think emotionally and environmentally, that probably presents a greater challenge for a player to walk off of campus after being at LSU, for example, for 4 weeks and sign his professional contract, as opposed to finishing his high school season, being excited about either one of these paths as well. But also, I think just the fact that there were so many viable quality players from the college ranks who had fewer alternatives, it had close to expired college eligibility, probably made some of the finances, disproportionate, even if the player quality was somewhat similar between those players as well.
And there's one more there from Roderick.
Great question, Roderick. I will go back to one of the things that Chris said of how success in scouting, kind of regardless of what term or definition you use for it, is so low that it does hold greater greater weight when an NDFA does make it to the major leagues. But I think that there's also an indication that nobody has necessarily magic pixie dust as well, and it's probably a developmental success story. Or if you passed on the player, in our case, 21, and one of our NDFAs got to the major leagues, that's also not a great indication of our organizational valuation of the player at the draft. So we kind of, for the most part, identify those as outliers and probably treat them as such in most cases.
Okay, great. I think we're caught up.
Over to you, Sam.
Okay, Clint, thank you so much, and Dr. Phillips, thank you so much as well. This has been a ton of fun so far, and I'll do what I can to kind of keep pace with the opening 2 presentations. I should have known that going third was actually a bad idea, but here we go. So another quick note about my work with Cleveland. I do work a little bit more in our player development space than I do our scouting space. So I'll do my best to kind of discuss the transition that these players face once they're finally entering pro baseball and what it might look like for them as they're beginning their professional careers. I'll also go ahead and touch on some of our top picks, specifically diving into the top 4 guys that we drafted in 2021. I think this has been brought up a little bit already. There have been a ton of changes, not just to the draft, but also to the construction and structure of minor league baseball that has also had a huge effect on the way that players are brought into pro baseball and what the beginning stages of their career look like. So we'll try and touch on that as well. Then finally, I'll kind of leave the group with a couple almost key questions of things that we just continue to ask ourselves over and over and over again as we're trying to really drive our decision-making process on the developmental side, trying to make sure that all of our players are being put in the right environments at the right time for their long-term success. Clint, do we have one more slide here with the names of our draftees? Here we go. Okay. So for a little bit of information on our class overview, as Clint mentioned much earlier in the presentation, based on our draft positions in the first 10 rounds and the associated bonus slot values of those picks, we were given just under $7.5 million to spend on our top draft picks, which was the 9th smallest total in the entire draft. So that is going to make a big difference in the types of players that we are able to select, even after accounting for the draft position where, if we're drafting 23rd in the first round, that automatically means that there are going to be 22 players that are unavailable for us to select, no matter how much we like them. We ended up making 21 total selections in the draft. And in many ways, the makeup of our draft class was very similar to some of the trends that we saw throughout the industry. 19 of our 21 picks were pitchers, and 18 of those were college pitchers. One quick note on how we had 21 selections, even though there were only 20 rounds. As a smaller market team, as Clint touched on early on in his presentation, the draft is so important to our success. And the league acknowledges that based on the financial structure of the industry, that they actually give smaller market teams what are called competitive balance picks. So we actually picked 69th overall with almost one of these bonus picks, in addition to our other 20-round picks. Notably, of the 21 players that we drafted, we signed every single one of them. That's certainly not always the case. I think Clint mentioned that usually we signed 30 of the 40 selections. This year, we're bringing every single one of our selections into our organization. We also signed 2 players as non-drafted free agents. After drafting and signing so many pitchers, we decided we also needed some catchers. If anything, just to catch, practice bullpens and make sure that we were able to field a real team when games started. So we signed 2 catchers who had gone undrafted, one from East Carolina and one from Purdue. So I thought it'd be really interesting to touch on our top 4 selections to give a little bit more details into who these players are and what really stood out to our group during the scouting process. Starting with the guy that we took with our first round pick, number 23 overall, Gavin Williams. Gavin is a big, strong right-handed pitcher from East Carolina University with a truly power arsenal. He checks in at 6'6" and weighs 240 pounds, and he's hit triple digits with his fastball. We've had multiple scouts who went in to see him who saw him hit 101. Williams started his career at ECU as a reliever before transitioning to a starting pitcher role in 2021, when he logged over 80 innings. Williams also features a big curveball and a hard slider that he used to generate more than 10 strikeouts per 9 innings in 3 consecutive college seasons, including a 14.75 mark in 2021, one of the better marks in all of college baseball. Meanwhile, he only walked 21 batters in 80 innings. Our scouts were really impressed by his improvements in overall strike throwing in 2021 while he transitioned into a starting pitcher role. Williams was a highly touted amateur even back to his high school days. The first scouting reports we have on him are actually from late 2016 and early 2017. Just one example of our scouts doing an excellent job of developing history with a player. I think this is one of the things that Dr. Phillips talked about quite a bit as you start to learn more about players over time. I think Gavin Williams is a really, really tremendous example of that. We've known this player for going on 5 years before we end up selecting him in the first round. Our second pick in the second round was a left-handed pitcher named Doug Nikhazy. Nikhazy is a smaller left-handed pitcher from the University of Mississippi. He was a 3-year starter in college and totaled over 200 innings in his college career, even after the 2020 season limited him to just 4 starts. Nikhazy has been an exceptional performer throughout his career. His ERA was never above 3.4 in any season, and he topped 12 strikeouts per 9 in both the 20 and 21 seasons. Nikhazy also pitched for Team USA back in 2019. He features a fastball, curveball, and slider mix, and he's shown true pitchability by mixing and matching different approaches to different hitters, as opposed to just overpowering them. I saw that there was one question. Joe, do you think it makes sense to
Go right ahead, whenever you're comfortable and picking it up, Sam.
Great. You know, on some of those, Bob and Devin, on some of those maybe more general scouting questions, I might leave those to the end. Clint's going to be in a much better position to answer those than myself. So maybe I'll run through the rest of our just our top guys, and then we can return to this. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's perfectly fine.
Great. So moving on to the player that we took with that competitive balance pick at number 69 overall, Tommy Mace is another huge right-handed pitcher. This one from the University of Florida. Mace also registers 6'6". He's a little bit leaner at 220 pounds, but also shows an above-average fastball. He pitched for 4 years at Florida after his own decorated high school career. Once again, he's another college arm for whom we have scouting reports from both 2016 and 2017. Mace complemented his Florida career with appearances in the Cape Cod League in 2018 and for Team USA in 2019. So he's faced some of the best competition, amateur competition in the world, and had a lot of success at the highest levels. He stands out for an exceptionally deep arsenal. Our scouts tracked him as throwing 6 different distinct pitches in 2021, a 4-seam fastball, a sinker, a curveball, a slider, a changeup, and a cutter, all at the same time, all as part of his repertoire. Finally, after spending so much time talking about college pitching, it feels right to end with a high school position player. Jake Fox, our third round pick, our 4th overall selection, is a middle infielder from Florida who is actually also committed to the University of Florida. Fox stood out to our scouts because of his defense, his speed, his bat to ball skills, and his advanced hitting approach for a high school player. Fox's father also played professional baseball as well, so he grew up around the game in a way that few others get to experience. Clint, do you want to hit on these two questions here?
I think it's a great note on basically the demographics of our class. The area that we made the most selections was the Carolinas, which makes a lot of sense because it is also actually the densest when it comes to college players. Separately, there was a heavy investment in Florida and California, particularly the University of Florida, where we drafted 3 players. So we actually drafted their entire weekend rotation. So we had of roommates who went from their time together in Gainesville out to Arizona. There was definitely a heavy investment there, which I think historically lines up with the trends of the draft. Roughly 45% of all selections come from Florida, California, and Texas, with Florida comprising about 23 to 25% of the overall draft class is the most representative state. And then about New England and New Yorkers, typically it doesn't produce as much as the warm weather states, but this was actually a really exciting and banner year for the Northeast in general, where if you just look at the top 5 rounds, it actually produced more than double the number of selections as well. If anything, actually underrepresents the quality of the class because there were a lot of talented high school players who are going to go to college. This was actually the best year in the Northeast for the, compared to the past decade or so.
Clint, before you get off that question, could I just briefly ask, pick number 6, Aaron Davenport, University of Hawaii. Is there a story there about who got to take those trips to?
Yeah, there's always people who are arm wrestling for a chance to get out to Hawaii. But the conference that they play in, they actually have most of their games stateside. So they come to, Southern California frequently. And Aaron is really talented. He has great control, really good spin qualities as well. And he's from the Pacific Northwest, like around the Seattle area. Got a lot better, over the course of his college career. But somebody who actually played on Cape this summer before the draft, so he was actually one of the few players who was active from the conclusion of his major league season, or his spring season, until the draft. So we were able to continue gaining history with him. One of the few guys, not just in our draft class, but in any as well.
Good, thank you. I guess the other question from Devin there.
So regarding when players count against the limit, it's a very different equation from prior years when players, basically the standard was get them signed and just push them out to to one of the affiliates, usually New York League, for college players, or Arizona. But now, once a player plays in a game, you have basically 14 days until you have to make a corresponding decision. Or sorry, 14 days after he signs his contract, or once he plays in game action. Therefore, we have not activated many of those players so far. Only 2 of our players from this year's class have been activated. Because it would come with a corresponding release, and because we invested so many picks in pitchers who are going to take more time to ramp up.
Good.
Great. Thanks, Clint. I'll keep going with some of our considerations around developmental opportunities, and then we can circle back for additional questions at the end.
Okay.
So in the past, following the draft, we've had a little bit more of a formal signing ceremony, which is basically a big party where we bring out players and their families, either to Arizona or to Cleveland, and really kind of welcome them to the organization as best we can. This has been honestly one of the most enjoyable activities that we've had over the past few years. Although, of course, we couldn't have it in 2020. And we actually didn't have it this year in 2021 either. We did have all of our drafted players out at our complex in Arizona right after the draft to finish up their medical process, formally sign their contracts, and then prepare to start their professional careers. So by the time we've signed each player, we've already done a lot of the legwork to think through what some of their highest developmental needs are going to be. Now that they're signed and they're healthy and they're in our group, they're at our complex, it's time to introduce them to the organization and to professional baseball. Our goal isn't to have them start as quickly as possible, or even necessarily to dominate the lower levels. We want to make sure that we're setting them up for long-term success. As Clint mentioned, the 2021 draft was by date one of the latest on record, if not the latest. This means that players were more removed from their amateur competition than they usually are. This is especially important for pitchers who in many cases had not pitched in games in over 2 months by the time they signed their contracts. It's really critical that we make sure that these guys are in proper physical shape before they actually return to game action. As Clint mentioned, there are also other roster considerations that become very, very important based on the restructuring of the minor leagues for the first time this year. But most critically, a lot of these guys, their college seasons end in, sometime in May, maybe a little bit later. And frequently they are actually recommended to not continue to pitch throughout the summer to make sure that they are in the best possible position for when they have to go through that post-draft physical. They don't want to get injured leading up to the draft, especially when they're not playing in games anymore. So they take that stretch of time very, very carefully on purpose. That also means that they're a little bit not quite in shape to pitch right away once they are signed. We've kind of accepted that, acknowledge it, and now try and figure out how to turn that into a benefit for us, where we can think a little bit more of the long-term picture as opposed to just being excited to get them into games right away. So once we have them and they're kind of ready to go, we also make sure that we're doing our best part, our best part to support them entering professional baseball, which is a huge change from their amateur lives. They no longer have their schedules dictated by class. They no longer have limits on their practice time imposed by the NCAA. They're true professionals. It's a whole new lifestyle. Making sure that they're ready for that is a huge part of our jobs. We need to make sure that they're supported in a holistic fashion, meaning we introduce them to all different parts of our organization. We have our medical group. We want to make sure the players are putting themselves in the best position to stay healthy and to stay on the field. We have our physical or our strength and conditioning group. We want to make sure the players know their way around the weight room. What kind of exercises are they doing? Are they doing them with proper form? Are they doing the right exercises that are going to best support their development? We have a nutrition group. Do the players know how to prepare meals for themselves when they're away from the complex? Even when they are at the complex, what kind of foods are they eating and how is that supporting their nutritional goals? We have a mental performance department. How are we making sure that these players learn how to deal with both success and failure, both on and off the field, now that they're professionals? And then finally, we have our fundamental group, our pitching coaches, our hitting coaches, our defense coaches. How are the players working on their craft? What are the highest leverage areas of developmental growth from a fundamental perspective? To the extent that we have organizational philosophies and drill packages and practice routines, we have to make sure the players understand both how to perform each activity and why they are being asked to do so. This is where things get really, really fun for our group. I mentioned before that we've already done a lot of the legwork to think through what the highest leverage developmental items are for each player. A lot of this work has been done by our scouting group, and some of the most fun conversations that we have every single year are between our scouts and our minor league coaches to help introduce the newly drafted players to the organization. The information our scouts provide factors in throughout the developmental process for years to come. It always provides a baseline that we refer back to, and we can use it to make sure the player is trending in the right direction. I have a favorite story from being at a AA Akron game a few years ago. Without naming any names, one of our players was having a really hard time controlling his emotions on the field. Whenever he would strike out or something didn't go his way, it wasn't exactly a pretty sight. Our coach was looking through some old reports, trying to figure out how to best support the player, and found a report written on the player as an amateur 5 years before that date that suggested there was already some concern with how the player would handle failure, along with some notes from the player's college coach on how they handled that situation when the player was in college. The fact that this had been such a long-standing topic of discussion around the player had a huge influence on the way the coach wanted to approach the player and try to tackle the problem. This wasn't some new thing that came up. It was something that the player has been dealing with for quite a while. We wouldn't know that without all the work that the scout had done a full 5 years ago. We also knew some strategies that had been tried in the past and that could use those to help dictate how we wanted to kind of act in the future. When things did turn for the better and improve soon after, there was a great call between that coach and that amateur scout about how helpful the 5-year-old report ended up being in the player's developmental process. These things do not end on the date of the draft. They're useful for years to come. Turning back to the minor league season and some of the roster limits and realignment that we've seen throughout minor league baseball, they've created some huge changes in how we can develop our players. In 2019, the last full minor league season, we had our 4 full season affiliates, AAA Columbus, AA Akron, High A Lynchburg, and Low A Lake County, in addition to short season Mahoning Valley and two different rookie ball teams based out of Arizona. Typically, the short season Mahoning team would start shortly after the early June draft, and many of our college age players that we would draft would report directly there to start their professional careers, directly to Mahoning Valley. High school players, on the other hand, would report to Arizona, where they traditionally begin in rookie ball. This year, the short season league that Mahoning played in was eliminated as part of the reconstruction, and we are left with only one rookie ball team. Now, we don't have that intermediate level between complex league rookie ball and full season ball that makes that gap that much bigger. As has been discussed already, we are only allowed 180 domestic players, a significant reduction from previous years. With the draft limited to 5 rounds in 2020 and 20 rounds in 2021, we brought in many fewer players than previous years, which also has a big impact on how our minor league teams are constructed. I do think one additional interesting note about some of the non-drafted free agents and signing additional players from places like independent ball factor in even more, kind of really coincides with some of our concerns about pitcher workload and how quickly we can get some of these pitchers back out there. There are real concerns with pitchers who did not pitch a lot in 2020 and only pitched maybe a little bit less than they would have in a regular year in 2021. Now they might be asked to ramp back up to continue to pitch at the end of 2021, all while really preparing for their first full season of full professional baseball in 2022. When we think about workload, we have to think about it from a long time horizon. We can't just think about what the player has done recently. If the player hasn't pitched or hasn't played a lot of games over the last several years, that's going to have a huge impact in the way that we treat our players and the way that we kind of almost deploy them throughout our organization. It's really unfortunate, there have been a ton of injuries to pitchers this year. I don't have the exact numbers on it, but my hunch is that it is way more than we would see in a typical year. When you combine that with the 180 player limit, teams have been stretched pretty thin when it comes to pitching, even at any of their minor league levels. That has led to a lot of additional signings that come from a little bit of maybe a little bit more of non-traditional backgrounds, like the different independent leagues and like non-drafted free agents. So finally, I'll leave you with a couple overarching questions that drive a lot of our decision-making processes on the player development side. So in a similar fashion to past years, the minor league season still ends in early to mid-September. Again, with the later draft, our players are entering the organization closer to that end of season deadline. There are also fewer games on the minor league schedule, partly instituted as a way to limit travel during the pandemic. So at every minor league level this year, every full season minor league level, Monday is a universal off day. There are no Monday off days, there are no Monday games. Games are played from Tuesday through Sunday against the same team 6 games in a row before traveling to the next city or staying at home and waiting for the next opponent. This has really limited the total number of games that are being played, in addition to a later start date. Opening day for minor leagues this year was May 1st, as opposed to closer to April 1st. So fewer overall games means fewer innings and fewer plate appearances to go around. As an organization, we have to decide the answers to critical questions around this new schedule. Who do we want those innings and those plate appearances to go to? In addition to our 2021 draftees, we also have 2019 and 2020 drafted players who have yet to play a full season. We also have all of our international signs that are itching to get their stateside careers going. If we would really want to talk about how difficult scouting is, imagine scouring Latin America for 14 and 15-year-olds who are going to sign at 16, let alone players who are playing at the SEC at the age of 21 or 22. Many of these trade-offs between playing time and different player deployment don't only come in the form of lineup decisions and who the starting pitcher might be, but in some really challenging cases in the form of player release decisions. As Clint mentioned earlier, after we sign a player and assign him to an affiliate, frequently that's going to come with a corresponding move in the form of a release of a player, which in many cases will end that player's career, or at least give every other organization the opportunity to sign that player. That's a huge cost. We've already kind of had to limit our organization to these 180 players, which is way less than it used to be. We really like these 180 players. It is a big cost to have to get rid of any of them. And those are critical decisions that have to get made really, really frequently. Finally, as we're thinking of the longer term development for these players, 2022 is going to be the first full professional season for many players within our organization. These guys have been playing baseball all their lives, but they will have never focused on baseball exclusively from February through September to such a degree. How can we best prepare them for that? What do we need to do to create a support structure that's going to give them their best chance of reaching their highest potential and their best chance at success? It's the kind of thing that we talk about every day. And it's the answers are ever evolving. I think that's all I have prepared, but would be happy to answer any questions that there are. Or
we got several questions queued up here, starting with Rod Nelson's about the connection between the Indians' top pick and the NDFA choices.
Sam, if you want, I can jump in on a few of these.
Great. Yeah, Clint, go for it. Thank you.
Rod, that is very astute of you to recognize that one of the two non-drafted free agents was Seth Cadell, who was actually the battery mate for Gavin Williams at East Carolina for multiple years. So yeah, the two NDFAs were catchers, and it's been really great to have Seth and Gavin together. They've spent a lot of time, helping one another matriculate to the organization, just the whole assimilation process. Not only are they teammates, they're also very good friends as well. It's kind of funny because we valued Seth quite a bit independent of the connection with Gavin, but that really was the cherry on top with his acquisition. Additionally, Ken asked a great question about basically the difference of power conferences for college players versus lesser known conferences. And we do try to scout players in the summer when the competition is less uneven, which are some good small school players who go to the Cape, Northwoods League, the aforementioned Alaska League as well. So really starting early with those players from less acclaimed leagues is really important, just because you're not going to have maybe the same statistical inputs that you will for some of those bigger conferences as well. One of the keys, honestly, to modern scouting, we feel, is really basically knowing what information to use for player demographics. And that really shows quite prominently with the use of video. So nearly all power conferences have video available for every single pitch of every single game. That's not the case with D2 and D3 and NAIA players. So we encourage our scouts to be more enterprising, spend more time in person with those players from smaller conferences where we don't have the deep reserves of video, whereas we know that we can rely on data and video a little bit more to put the pieces together for those bigger conference players. Additionally, we try to use basically all information at our disposal to identify undervalued players, whether that be scouting inputs, industry information, analytical tools, data, really whatever we can get our hands on that we find to be predictive for indicating future value, we're going to use to not only select players, but help encourage our scouts to spend our time on those players as well. Another question was about basically housing. And when all of our players report to Arizona, they are housed in a state-of-the-art complex that is literally right across the street, a stone's throw away from our player development complex. And that was built 2 years ago. At the time, we were the second organization behind the Pirates actually to build almost an on-campus state-of-the-art facility. Since then, a few have broken ground. I think 3 organizations in Arizona are trying to do so, but it's been a huge benefit for us and also for the players. They don't have to have their own vehicle, drive, miles here and back to the complex. It's much more convenient and also really helps from the nutritional standpoint as well. The fact that they can literally roll out of bed and go down and get, the best cooking in the West Valley as well from our complex. The purpose of the Major League Baseball draft league, Major League Baseball wanted to try to help with the draft date moving back, was trying to aggregate the most talented draft eligible players who would still be active after their college seasons and provide them with a better platform than having to go to any number of disparate summer college leagues where you maybe have the coaching infrastructure, the data and player development infrastructure as well. So I believe this year there were about 40 players who were drafted who participated in the league, which was a really good start. And I think they're really only going to continue to build out the talent pool for that league. This year presented significant challenges because the draft league was first announced in November of last year. But by that time, players were already committed to playing on the Cape or playing other places, and they definitely didn't want to steal from other leagues. So we'll continue to see investment within that draft league. We did not select a player who participated in the draft league, however. All right, sorry, the last two questions. I'm just catching up from.
Yeah, there's one about recommendation of readings. Those who want to learn more.
I would think anything that Dr. Phillips produces should be at the top of the list. And also, I guess it depends on what part of scouting. If you're looking scouting history, some of the aforementioned books that he mentioned are great. And there's some more modern ones as well. Extra 2% stands out. But yeah, I think really anything within that realm to kind of speak to the origin story of scouting is quite fascinating. But honestly, I think Dr. Phillips is probably better equipped to answer that than I am.
I'll just say that SABR has put out a book, Can He Play? That Rod Nelson was involved with the SABR Scouting Committee. So that's a great place for SABR members to start with the Can He Play volume. And it's got some history and some interviews. And so it's a good overview overall.
Great. Okay, we got two last questions here, looks like.
Rod, it's a tremendous question about identification of international players. I think each in their signing scout, each team handles that a little bit differently. For example, if you look at Baseball America Prospect Handbook, which also designates a specific scout, you will often see 3 or 4 scouts listed for international players. It can get a little bit messy because you have the area scout, the cross-checker, the scouting director. I don't know, honestly, the origin of why in amateur scouting, there's always just the area scout listed compared to an international, why there's 4 or 5. But because of that kind of convoluted nature, that's why within our media guide, we actually just tried to simplify it and didn't have anybody listed. But again, I'm not sure of the origin of the industry norms. It's a great question. And then, do married players also live in the residential facility? It happens so infrequently that we have, players, especially at the lower levels of the minor leagues, that are married. That I don't think that has actually come up with or since the player development complex was built or apartment complex was built 2 years ago. But in the upper levels of the minors, I believe there are separate facilities for players who are married.
A logistical question for you two guys. Are you comfortable in sharing your charts tonight if anybody would ask for them?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're coming upon the witching hour here of 9:30. A tremendous, I believe, 2 hours together, and I can't say enough in the way of thank you to Chris and Sam and Clint. You've really given us so much and shared so much. It's been so valuable. And on behalf of our chapter and SABR, thank you so much. I hope it was as enjoyable for you all as it was for us. And before we ring off tonight, and you're getting some really nice comments in the chat box. Before we ring off tonight, just for next meeting purposes, September 15th, we're going to have another evening meeting. It's going to be devoted to the Negro Leagues and players that you may not have heard about as much as some of the more prominent players and players you might want to know a little bit more about. And we're going to look at it from a number of perspectives. I'll have some information out in the next few days or a week or so, but we're looking forward to having another really great event the evening of Wednesday, September 15th. So I think with that, again, I want to sincerely thank our speakers, Chris, Clint, and Sam. Thank you so much. And if anybody does want the charts. I've had a couple of emails already. Please feel free to send me an email and I will get the charts out to you. So with that, I think it's time to say good night. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Dr. Phillips,
you.
are you still there?
Thanks, everybody.
I'm still here.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Yeah. Would you be willing to speak to another SABR chapter?
Of course.
Oh, the same lines. Okay. I head up a chapter down in Houston, if you ever know where that is, and please don't boo. We've had kind of a problem with that on it. But if you could let me know the best way to contact you so we could set something up.
Sure. My email's in my slides. So yeah, anyone who has additional questions, just feel free to reach out.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Very good. All right. Thank you very much. And we'll sign off. Have a great evening, everybody. What's left of it. Bye-bye.